I'd like to be able to claim that this will be the first day of the rest of your life, but I would be projecting my own experience of discovering what projection is for the psyche. Instead of saying, with Freud, that psyche is extended, I began to say that psyche actually is the extension itself. This has been a big turning point, for me at least. Before I thought of projective geometry as a necessary fiction required to describe the weird way the unconscious was wired to our everyday thoughts and behaviors. More and more, I came to realize that psyche is the logic and substance of this extension of soul into the world, and that it is in tune with, and even sets the pace for, the varied pulses of culture and change. The move from thinking of the 2D topology of projection as an add-on to a standard and familiar Euclidean template, I've come to realize that what is mathematically true for geometry is also true for the human subject, that projectivity is primary and primal, and that the psyche, by projecting, produces what it projects into. The first fruits of this movement are anamorphic and uncanny. To show how this could happen, I'd like to start with the first theorems of projective geometry, discovered by Pappus of Alexandria in 300 AD, and then also the twist that French architect Girard Desargues gave Pappus's theorem in 1648. It took almost 150 years for projectivity to catch on, and it flourished for the whole of the 19th century before being absorbed into quantum physics. But its legacy in psychoanalysis and other human sciences has yet to be realized. Perhaps you can help. When things are historically second, but logically first, our discovery of them comes as a surprise. We want to ask, what was projective geometry before it was projective geometry? I think the answer here is that projective geometry first appeared in the form of two aspects of our cultural origins, anamorphosis and the uncanny. The problem with Euclidean geometry is that it's not about culture. It's about culture when culture gets cleaned up. All the uncanny parts have been cleared away. Things look normal and reasonable, and we have gotten used to this cleaned-up world, so much so that anything uncanny, such as anamorphosis, looks truly weird. We build in Euclidean assumptions practically from the moment we open our eyes and mouths, but there's always just a little bit missing. Projective geometry is reversed. There seems to be only 1% that makes sense. The rest is unintuitive. But once you start to make sense of its involvement of chance and necessity, of infinities that are not just possible but all too close, and of shadows that are more like second souls than mere optical effects, projective geometry seems to have a corner on the market of the uncanny. Its twists and inside-out inversions are something we can relate to, especially when things go wrong, when we are surprised or astonished, or in the common experiences of things like coincidence, déjà vu, and luck. It seems that Euclid explains only the things we already know about, whereas projective geometry explains the stuff we really do need to have explained. We can take the most famous of Pappus's theorems and prove how something that seems impossible is actually necessary thanks to invisible laws. Take two lines placed anywhere on a flat plane. Put 3 points on each line. The reason for 3 will be evident later. We're going to connect the 3 points 2 pairs at a time. And to do this, you have to have 3 points. 2 won't work. Go from A on one line to B prime on the other, then from B prime to A prime, then cross back to B. This cross has to be done for all 3 of the possible combinations, A to B, B to C, and A to C. 2 sets of 3 dots, 3 crisscrosses. What should amaze you is that the 6 points randomly placed on 2 lines randomly placed results in crosses at points that will always fall along a straight line, which I'll call an eigenvector, meaning that the line belongs to the other lines and points. Pappus was generally forgotten until the 17th century, when an architect, Girard Desarges, read his works and discovered that the theorem could be used to develop a technique allowing stonemasons to define irregular surfaces precisely. But the stonemasons were not happy about this. They had workaround techniques that they kept as trade secrets, and having a rational technique would undermine their monopoly. The shadow created by the visible side of things is like a chunk of space generated no matter where we look or move. It rebounds to the line around the object, the profile, where the invisibility is generated. So the force of looking meets up with the opposite force of the failure to see beyond a solid. Because this meetup is a consequence of our specific viewing point, the point antipodal to our eye becomes the eye of the shadow that lies at an equal and opposite position. This makes each silhouette at the edge of each visible object a kind of charged line. We always compare someone's profile with their character and call a description of someone a profile, as if it both tells a story of what we can see and what we can't see. Typically, a profile is taken with the head turned sideways to show that the person can see what we can't see and is always hiding something. Desargues' theorem projects points that all lie on the same line by connecting corresponding sides of triangles. It works for any 2 triangles drawn at any angle and any place within the cone of vision. Desargues used triangles to epitomize the space in the cone of vision, but the principle is not just about triangles. It's about the nature of the parts of space we can't see, that are the consequences of the things we can see. This means that the invisibility produced by our perception has order and logic, but it also means that this order always creates an uncanny effect, because our positive looking generates a negative self-canceling effect. In mythology and folklore, shadows have just such a negative reputation. What lies behind our view is something we associate with rivals, doubles, and even the idea that someone out there wants to take our place. This goes back a long ways in history, when the ancient Egyptians believed in a shadow soul called the Ka that accompanied the living person throughout their life and after death had to be placated. Ka is difficult to translate. It's not exactly a double or shadow. Rather, it's a presence that's remote and intimate at the same time, something that can be felt as an in-between, a messenger. Normally, objects dominate their shadows, which have a random style of existence. But when the shadow is more structured than what generates it, we feel we have learned a secret, as in the British artists Tim Noble and Sue Webster's artfully arranged pile of trash. This reversal of the normal hierarchy of order puts forward the idea that the shadow knows more than what projects it, and that its separate existence is a real possibility. What relation could these numbers possibly have? Any guesses? Still no ideas? Well, some of you may have guessed that if you put the numbers in ascending order, it will be apparent geometrically that each number is the sum of the previous 2 numbers, and that the result is what is called the golden rectangle, which many have related to the growth principle. The weirdness of the number system, however, has to do with the way it relates to itself. Repeating the series and then cutting the two down the middle produces successively more accurate estimates of the Fibonacci ratio, phi. It's not a real number, just an estimate that can eat up as many decimal places as you have to offer. The considerable number of weird relations that can be discovered within the golden rectangle implicate what's called the vesica Pisces, or two circles intersecting to make a lozenge or fish shape in the middle. This is a circle that circles itself and divides itself at the same time, just like the 1 numerically cut into itself to produce the sequence of numbers defining the phi. Jos Lei's animations allow us to see how complex forms, such as the cross-cap, combine a lower part that contains space like a bowl and an upper part that exchanges its inside with its outside. But we have to remember that anything we can see with our eyes is a form that really exists in two-space, where we do not have any way to see, because there is no projection of light from objects to eyes. Instead, we see the projective form as something immersed into three-space, where we have to use fictional methods to explain what's happening. The fictional element here is the material surface that has two sides, which Jos Lei's must decorate with beach ball colors to show how the cross-cap is both a container downstairs, but an exchange system upstairs. Freud says as much when he says that Psyche is extended, knows nothing of it. The unconscious seems to be a kind of container in the sense that suppressed contents have to go somewhere to be perfectly preserved, but in another sense, the unconscious is only the process of containment and release, an in and out. Lacan comes along and puts geometry to work to explain the psyche and its suppression functions. So we not only have a contrast between two ways of conceptualizing reality, those two ways are able to switch places. It's the reversibility of these two distinctive ways of looking at the world, one symbolic and Euclidean, the other imaginary and projective, that make the 3D world and 2D world work like anamorphic doubles. The usual way of defining anamorphosis is to point to examples of the 16th century, where it was the fashion to paint murals on walls that were distorted when looked at straight on, but which made visual sense when viewed from a single, set viewing point. This is a nice analogy, but anamorphosis involves a much wider range of things that are capable of shifting their shape and requiring the viewer to take up strange positions. Perhaps the most famous of these was a close relative of the distorted mural, but in Holbein's Portrait of the Ambassadors, the position and the shape that suddenly comes into view have deeper meaning. Jacques Lacan famously mentioned this painting in his Seminar 11, the four principal concepts of psychoanalysis, but he was missing some key data. On the back of the painting, Holbein wrote the exact time of completion, but the problem was it was too exact. He gave not only the year, the month, and the day, but the hour down to the minute. The reason for this precision was that his friend, the astronomer and astrologer, Luca Pacioli, had predicted that this moment would be the precise time of the apocalypse. He also worked it out that the sun would be at precisely 27 degrees above the London horizon at 4 p.m. And this number gave Holbein a reason for structuring the angles in his paintings based on the number 3, if only to refer to the Holy Trinity and the prophecy that time would come to an end after 3 500-year eons, plus the age of Christ at the time of crucifixion, 33. Holbein got the viewer of the corrected image of the skull to kneel beneath the cross, to take the place of Golgotha, where it was alleged that the skull of Adam was buried. All of these clues are about the coincidence of the two lines of Desargues' perfect shadow, a line of life to death at the vanishing point where parallel lines come together, and a line of death to life where fate comes back to strike down the subject who has seen this reminder, this memento mori. The psychologist Ernst Jentsch formalized these directions as life in death and death in life, and Freud took these as the foundational design of the logic of the uncanny in all its forms. These are foundational to cultural rituals, sacrifices, and other practices that lack a rational basis but have a poetic resonance. They are what we must feel must be without being able to explain why. So projective geometry, through anamorphosis and the uncanny, has an enormous role in the extension of the psyche. And this tells us just how and why the psyche is extended and is another name for human culture.